All right, I'm good.
We're good?
Yeah.
Splendid. Well, let's talk about disaster, shall we? We'll start at the beginning. And I'm mostly going to talk about the things we are pretty darn sure of. And then at the end, we'll talk about these slightly more speculative aspects. Obviously, those would be what happens with the solar micronova, with the Earth turning over, things of that nature. Those are slightly more speculative, even though, in my opinion, and many of you share this opinion, the evidence suggests that those are by far the best answers we have to actually explain the evidence. But in terms of what we'd call as close to certainty as a scientist is willing to go, here's what we know. About every 6,000 years, there is a geomagnetic change on our planet. Every other cycle, or every 12,000 years, it's really, really bad. The last minor one was about 6,000 years ago. The last really bad one, 12,000 years ago. Who knows the name of the big one that happened about 40-something thousand years ago? That was Lachamp. Who knows the name of the one 36,000 years ago? Mono Lake, 24,000 years ago. Lake Mungo. What about the half cycle 18,000 years ago? Helena Polly, 12,000 years ago. Gothenburg. And who remembers the one from 6,000 years ago, what they're calling that one? Tianqi. Noah was what I would call it for a while. And then I started calling it the China event. And then the Chinese scientists wanted to get a little bit more specific, and they call it the Tianqi event. But so every 6,000 years, we get one of these. Every 12,000 years, it's really bad. 6,000 years ago was a minor event. 12,000 years ago was quite bad. So we are perfectly due in time for the next 12,000 year event, the big one. And of course, what are we seeing with Earth's magnetic field? Precisely what we would expect to be seeing. The magnetic poles are shifting. The magnetic field is weakening. As the magnetic poles are shifting, the auroral ovals, the northern and southern lights, the circles they make around the polar region, they are starting to shift. As the magnetic field weakens, allowing more particle flux to come in, those auroras are becoming stronger. The ionosphere, the top of the sky, is becoming more energized. The atmosphere is changing in several ways. Now, when this really hits its full stride, when we are fully into the magnetic excursion, the magnetic pole shift, that magnetic field will not be protecting our planet very much from the sun or cosmic rays. As was shown for pretty much all of the previous events, this has very severe climate impact. It is a total environmental change. On top of a pretty significant climatological environmental change, there's an increase in the amount of radiation. We're subject to a certain amount of radiation as it is, whether it's ultraviolet from the sun or cosmic rays from the rest of the galaxy, but those numbers are going to jump up somewhere between 60 and 200%. So that's a change in the environment, in the climate, while you're being bombarded by radiation. Furthermore, the food chain takes a pretty bad hit from this as well, because while most everybody knows that birds use the magnetic field when they are migrating, so do a lot of mammals, deer, rabbits, even dogs, bears. Marine creatures use it as well. Everything from salmon trying to find their breeding grounds to turtles, sharks, whales, and about 40 different kinds of fish that we know of in the ocean, not to mention krill, phytoplankton, chlorophyll production, shrimp, crabs, lobster, insects as well. Significant effects on insects and on plants from seed to flowering. What this means is that there is, through that magnetic disruption on birds and mammals and things that use it to navigate either for migration or foraging or to find reproductive zones, combined with extra radiation on the body, combined with a climatological environmental shift, That sounds like it'd be pretty rough for the life on Earth. And well, that's exactly what it is, because all of the papers that study this have found that the largest clusters of species extinction occur exactly when these 12,000-year major cycles occur. In fact, we also know where on the planet it was worst. So last time, 12,000 years ago, where we are standing got hit the worst. Before that, it was Europe. Before that, it was Central Asia. And so here's what we know for a fact. There is this cycle. It is pretty darn good, pretty darn reliable. It has been the exact amount of time for the next one to be occurring. And everything you would expect to be seeing in terms of the magnetic field and the environment and its effects on our atmosphere are happening, and happening faster and faster and getting worse and worse. Meaning that what comes next, the cluster of species extinction, for the species that don't go extinct, somewhere between a 20 to 80% reduction of their overall population. That's what's coming. But it's much more than that as well, because we're pretty reliant on electricity as a species. And for a lot of different reasons. It's not just the lights, it's heating our homes when it's cold. It's air conditioning when it's too hot. It's water purification. It's water distribution. It's food production. It's food shipping and food distribution. It's food storage with refrigeration. It's 911. It's cell phones. It's the internet. Gas stations, ATMs, the stock market, banking, literally everything at risk due to the fact that we are losing our protection from the sun. Now, I'm not telling this audience anything they really don't already know, but it paints the broad picture of, okay, it's not hard to see why these are major clusters of extinction. The climate's changing. You're getting bombarded with radiation. There's magnetic disruptions up and down the food chain. And there's one thing we know. All you need to do is just hit one Jenga block out of the food chain, and it has serious effects up and down. Well, we're talking about multiple Jenga blocks being knocked out of the food chain here. And then on top of that, you have more than the potential, the extreme likelihood that we're going to be thrown back into the Stone Age. And this is all of a sudden the most important thing that is not really being talked about by the world at large. Speaking of the world at large, you guys enjoying this clown world we're in right now? What's the worst part? The economic, the cultural, the political? I do know one thing, and I'm sure many of you have heard me say this before. There are tons of studies on what that same radiation does to brain processes. Who thinks they know what the two main impacts to the human brain are of this excess cosmic radiation? All right, well, the first one is it makes it hard for the processes in the hippocampus to take place. It's this frontal part of your brain. It's what makes us different from everything else on this planet. It's where cognition comes from. And when that is inhibited, it's a fun way of saying everyone gets a little bit dumber. At the exact same time, something deep embedded near the center of our brain gets activated, overly excited. It's called the locus coeruleus. And this causes us to react, and how severely we react, to extreme emotions, most specifically terror, pain, anxiety, fear. So if it seems like the world is getting dumber, like it is becoming more emotionally unstable and reacting more to fear and panic and terror than they should be, yes, yes, it is. And there's a very good scientific explanation for why. These things, everything I've just told you, are relatively bulletproof from a scientific perspective, even before you talk about the solar micronova, or what's happening throughout the solar system, or the fact that it is all caused by the galactic current sheet, or the fact that it's going to culminate with the Earth turning 90 degrees. Even without that stuff, this is a terrifying event, and something we all need to prepare for. Something else that's pretty bulletproof I'm sure there were random survivors all over the world, but in terms of actual established civilizations, societies, cultures that survived, they've got some things in common, don't they? None of them were near the ocean. None of them were at low elevation, and almost all of them had a way to hide underground, whether you're talking about Cappadocia in Turkey, or you're talking about the cave dwellings up near Colorado Springs. The good news is we've gone through quite a bit of these as a species, and we are still here. Not only are we still here, but everyone alive today is descended from somebody who survived the last one, who's descended from somebody who survived the one before. If you are in this room listening to my voice, you have survival in your DNA. You are made to survive. Does that mean you can't get unlucky? Of course not. Does that mean that you can slack off and not care and not prep and just survive anyway? No, probably not. But what it means is that with the effort and the knowledge to go with it, guiding your effort, this is survivable for you, your children, your grandchildren, your friends, anybody you care about. I think that's pretty important to know as well. The severity combined with the hope. Awareness without the handicap of fear. You can be aware of something that is scary and not be crippled by fear. Fear just seems to be a thief of time, focus, and energy, which could be better spent preparing to survive yet again. Prove your bloodline still belongs here. Now, I realize that sounds kind of eugenics-esque right there, but what's a better way to say it? Think about it. Your ancestors fought saber-toothed tigers. Your ancestors fought off starvation thousands of times. Your ancestors realized where they were living wasn't going to work anymore, picked up and moved, just started walking for months on end until they found someplace better. Are you really going to let all your ancestors have done all of that to get you here today and give up? I hope not. Yeah, it'll be tough. But it should also be, as weird as this sounds, a little bit exciting. This is the cosmic Super Bowl. We're here for the most exciting time in the last 12,000 years. You don't want to know if you're up to the challenge? You don't want to put your children into the next stage of Earth and see what kind of a world they can build and their children can build and their children can build? As somebody with 3 kids, I want nothing more than to put them into the next stage of Earth. Of course, there are some other aspects to this, aren't there? The solar micronova is a big one. But before we get there, we have to go to what's causing all of this. The galactic current sheet. I will never forget, it was about 8 or 9 years ago. And who remembers Billy Yelverton in the plasma lab? I had him run electric current through a sphere magnet as it was spinning. I was trying to see if it would create the cosmic jets, you know, the jets going north and south, which it did. I was not expecting the torus of plasma around the equator, or seeing this wavy thing coming out of it. However, about a year and a half later, when Caltech and Berkeley did the study, extreme study, the first ever supercomputer simulation of cosmic jet creation, and they had the torus around the center with the waves coming out of it, I knew exactly what I was looking at. And I remembered that they had discovered that this existed for the sun and other stars as well. And since that time, they have not only characterized, as we discussed a little bit yesterday, the magnetic current sheet of our galaxy, but they've discovered it in several other galaxies. And it does turn out when you've got a spinning sphere magnet as the central engine of any system, you're going to have the jets, the torus, and the rippling, wavy magnetic current sheet. Well, what that means for a star like the sun, which is in the galactic plane, is over and over and over again, we're going to be hit by this galactic wave. Okay, what does that mean? This galactic wave acts like a Swiffer duster in space. collecting dust, bringing extra plasma, pushing neutral gases along with it, and then in the very center, bringing the actual galactic magnetic reversal. And the fact that this is a big, giant galactic level thing sweeping past our solar system is the perfect explanation, in fact, the only explanation I could ever really imagine, for why the entire solar system is changing. Pluto lost a fifth of its atmosphere in 1 year. Neptune, very well-known storm patterns, at least they were well-known until a couple of years ago when the storm pattern reversed and their major storms started going the other way, like a hurricane forming off the coast of Florida and then just shooting east across the Atlantic, slamming into Africa. Every meteorologist will tell you that's not possible on Earth. That's not how it works. Well, it was the same thing on Neptune, except it just reversed. Uranus, record storms, record aurora. Saturn, its superstorm, perfect 30-year pattern, except when it just arrived 10 years early. Jupiter, having tons of cloud anomalies and storm anomalies, but we can actually detect the magnetic field of Jupiter changing as well. Mars climate change, way more than ours. Their seismic changes, way more than ours. But most importantly, now Mars is thought to be alive. Its mantle is active. It's not a dead planet after all. And I am having a whale of a time reading all of these astronomers' explanations of, oh, this is why we thought Mars was dead. This is how we could have been wrong. This is why we didn't have the right answer before. And none of it makes any sense. It's literally gobbledygook nonsense. Of course, the real answer is they weren't wrong before. Mars was dead, but now it's waking back up. Obviously, the Earth has tons of changes beyond the ones that I started this talk with the auroral oval changing and the auroral intensity and the ionospheric excitation and the ionospheric collapse. The jet stream changes, the global temperature changes, the changes in the ocean, the change in Earth's rotation speed. We're speeding up faster and faster. Who remembers that part as well? Venus, we know the fastest winds have increased way more than the fastest winds here on Earth. And of course, when Bepi Colombo arrives at Mercury, it will probably give us the information about how Mercury's magnetic field is changing. It's not the centermost sphere in our system, though, is it? That's the sun. The sun's magnetic fields are changing most prominently in the corona. Its atmospheric chemistry, its coronal chemistry is changing. For the longest time, they thought its helium levels were relatively stable and unchanging. Au contraire, mon frere, the helium levels are shooting up more and more every year. What about the area in between the planets, interplanetary space? They are seeing more dust, more plasma, and more neutral gases from the top of the solar corona all the way out past Pluto. Literally everything you would expect to see, whether it's changes on the sun, changes on the planets, changes in interplanetary space, and the exact kinds of changes you would expect to see were we to be taking something like a galactic magnetic reversal, extra plasma, extra dust, and extra neutral gases. Boy, that's a lot of coincidences lining up, isn't it? Okay. Up next, we have this evidence on Earth, and it is concentrated in these 12,000-year layers. This is what, in my opinion, was Doug Vogt's greatest contribution. His going back to studies from the 1890s, the 1920s, the 1940s, and finding where they found these nova level isotopes, meaning it's an isotope so extreme, can't make it in a volcano, can't make it with a meteorite impact. You need a nova level explosion from a star. And there's a whole bunch of this concentrated within those 12,000-year disaster layers. Well, kind of hard to do that if it's not something from the sun. If it's coming from way far away, they would have decayed before they got to Earth. Never mind the magnetic dusty pinballs articles, if anybody remembers those. The magnetic fields of a supernova trap the dust, which is carrying those isotopes, within the remnant itself. When we look out and we see that supernova remnant, do we see it like dispersed and going everywhere, or is it sort of like a confined cloud? That's because the magnetic field of the supernova is keeping it in place. So one, if it's a distant supernova, It has no way to get here because the magnetic fields are going to keep it at the other star. And if that wasn't the case, the isotopes that they're identifying have relatively short half-lives. They would have decayed long before they got to the Earth. So the only answer is the sun. So then that brings up the question, okay, can the sun do it? Well, what are the two ways scientists know how to create a nova event on a star? And we're not talking about a supernova where the whole star explodes. We're talking about those recurrent nova events. There are two ways to make them. You either dump a bunch of material onto the star, or you give it a strong magnetic kick. Well, what's the galactic current sheet bringing again? Oh, that's right. A bunch of dust, a bunch of plasma, a bunch of neutral gases dumping material into our solar system at the same time as a galactic magnetic reversal. So there's your magnetic kick. The only two ways we know how to make a star go nova happen together at the exact same time because of the arrival of the galactic current sheet, which also happens to explain the geologic evidence. And as we went over yesterday a little bit, if you'll recall, you cannot explain the observations of the Milky Way galaxy and make it fit the physics of the galactic current sheet unless you have those booms going off within it. So it's the only way to explain the Earth evidence. It's the only way to make galactic observations match galactic physics. And the only two ways to do it arrive at the exact same time. The coincidences are really, really piling up at this point. So let's go with a couple more. When this shell from the micronova hits the Earth, it's going to induce a lot of electricity through the ground. Modern solar storms, 10,000 times, 100,000 times weaker than the micronova. We can already tell they induce electric current all the way down into the mantle, probably further, although we can't detect it. So when this happens, there will be a phenomenal amount of electric current surge through the crust and through the mantle, but most importantly, that little area where the crust and mantle meet, because it is not like plywood, the crust, sitting on top of a lake, just floating around where it wants to. The area right in the middle, it doesn't just go rock, 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 and then all of a sudden liquid, 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 liquid. That area where they touch, it's kind of in the middle, kind of like molasses, almost. Cold, old, dried molasses, letting them stick together to the point where the crust is literally stuck to the mantle. But when you surge all that electric current through that layer, which by the way is more conductive than the crust above it and the mantle below it, I'm not exactly sure why that is the case, but they have determined that. That area where they meet, called the low velocity zone, right in between the crust and mantle, it is the most conductive layer of the entire planet. Oh, it's going to take a surge of electricity like crazy. It's going to melt that molasses and unlock the crust from the mantle. Now, it's one thing to know that religious texts talk about the earth wobbling or the earth turning over. It's one thing for catastrophists of the last few centuries like Deluc, Cuvier, Leibniz, even Einstein to all say, you can't explain this without the earth turning over and huge tsunamis washing in. The two most important pieces of evidence that have been found in the last century are what Major White saved from Project Nanook. How thankful are you guys that he basically committed treason? I mean, he kept these classified documents from the field and from the Pentagon, which showed the Pentagon scientists from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which morphed into the CIA, by the way, along with the Rand Corporation determining, yeah, this is how this works. This fits the evidence, and this works from a physics and math perspective. The Earth tilts 90 degrees, then it tilts back later. It's exactly what the religious texts say. It's exactly what the ancient catastrophists say. And then you think about the mammoths, for example. Mammoths need to eat 1,000 pounds of vegetation a day, maybe more. Take a look at where they were found in the Arctic Circle. There's no vegetation for them to eat now, and we're 12,000 years into a warm Interglacial cycle. They were frozen there in a snap during a glacial cycle when it was colder. If there's no food for them to eat there now, how much food was there when the temperature was 5, 10, 15 degrees colder? The answer is there wasn't any food, and they weren't at the Arctic Circle. They were eating somewhere between the tropics and mid-latitude. The Earth turned over, and they put their head up from eating some grass and realized, it's getting cold around here, huh? It's getting a little chilly. You put all these things together, and it's way too many coincidences to ignore. Not to mention the fact that when people like Einstein did the math and said, when this happens next time, it will have to be Greenland coming down to the equator and the part of Antarctica next to Australia coming up to the equator. And what's interesting is when you do that, the new North and South Pole are where the poles are set to, the magnetic poles are on a meeting track right now. They're not staying on opposite sides of the planet. The magnetic poles are coming together. Well, the area where they're set to meet is one of the new poles in the Greenland tilt situation. You got to be kidding me. Two separate ways of analyzing Earth's tilt, and they give the same answer? Ooh. Is anybody keeping track of how many coincidences we're putting together? Paleomagnetism, paleoclimatology, modern geomagnetism, modern climatology, modern atmospheric science, planetary science throughout the solar system, heliophysics, astrophysics as a whole, galactic physics, neuroscience, radiation, health issues, all of these things combined, all telling the same story across how many different fields of science? And always remember, on top of all of this, you have an incredible amount of control over whether or not you, your children, your grandchildren survive this. It's important. Also important, I'm supposedly having to keep an eye on the clock. Boy, I said a lot in like 20 minutes, didn't I? Holy moly. That was something. I'm gonna shake that out for a second. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on what I've said thus far? Don't all speak at once. I'll keep talking then. So here's something super important, and I'm sure some of you have heard this talk before. Did any of you guys hear my story about the guy who had contained static charge in the water bottles at a Thunderbolts conference and the subsequent studies that were done? No. So this guy figured out some kind of way to let water inside of plastic water bottles hold a static charge. And he showed up at the Electric Universe conference and he was having people stick their finger in and get shocked. And he did this tons of times at different events, but he was also keeping track of something. And he would ask you a couple of questions beforehand, and at the time they didn't seem like they mattered. But he was basically trying to figure out whether or not you were a positive person with a positive mindset, or you were more of a naysayer, more of a negative individual. You know what he noticed? The positive people, the people who had positive thoughts and were of a positive mindset, when they got shocked, it was more like they were all smiling. Some of them even giggled, laughed. The people who had a negative mindset, they were somewhere between angry or dropped to their knees when they got shocked. When this micronova hits our planet, trust me, if it's enough electricity induced to unlock the crust, it's going to give all of us a shock. Every person, every animal, every rock, every blade of grass is going to get a shock. You want to be the kind who giggles and laughs when that happens. You don't want to be falling to your knees, because something very close to what the Bible says, men's hearts will fail them, is absolutely on deck. And it's not from fear. It's not because God's going to snap his fingers and just stop a bunch of our hearts. All of the tools of this design are already in place. They're familiar to us. We see them every day. The earth, the sun, the sky. I would keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, Earth's magnetic field is not our last line of defense. Our last line of defense is in here. Our bodies have an energy field. It's more than just our aura. The aura is an electric field, but there's a magnetic field to our planet as well, and they combine in the middle to make an electromagnetic field. How do you strengthen this? How do you protect yourself? Your diet, your physical well-being, your mental well-being, and your mental outlook, that positive or negative. All of these things matter. You want to give yourself, your children, your grandchildren the best chance you can. Prepare physically, mentally, and emotionally. And of course, make sure you have enough bullets. You'll probably need those too. All right, do we have any questions? Go ahead. Right. So the solar kill shot, I mean, in theory, it could happen this sunspot cycle. And that's another thing to remember when you're planning on this is, okay, you do want to think about where the world is going to be after the tilt. What's your climate likely to be? You do want to think about, okay, when the world tilts like that, which way are the tsunamis going? You do want to think about earthquakes and volcanoes and whether or not you're too close to a place like Denver, Colorado. But the other thing you want to think about is, can you survive your climate if there's an extended period of time between the solar kill shot that sends us back to the Stone Age and the micronova and the Earth tilting over? Right.
What's the timeline from that to
First of all,
that it's going to be huge, the big one?
so first of all, you should have the mindset that you're going to live forever and accept no other answers whatsoever. But beyond that, whenever the solar kill shot happens, has no bearing on the magnetic reversal, the micronova, the pole flip. That's just a fact of the sun does what it will do, and our magnetic protection from it is weakening. If it happens a month from now, we could have 15, 20 years of Stone Age living before the planet goes like this. And so you need to think to yourself, okay, if I live in Phoenix, where am I going to get water? And how am I not going to cook to death in the summer? Here, our thought process is, how do we survive that 1 or 2 bad weeks we get every winter here? When there's no electricity, we'll have to get our own firewood. We'll have to make sure we've got enough food stocked up. And so there's that question to it as well. Wherever you will plan to be, could you live there for several years if there's no electricity, if there's no civilization, and not die? And then keeping in mind the fact that the weather's probably going to be slightly worse than it already is. Like the swings from high to low will be even worse. So here the winters will be slightly worse. In Phoenix, the summers will be slightly worse. Good question, though. Anyone else?
When you talk about the electric current coming, that's going to be really strong and affecting us all, like all human beings and stuff like that. Do you suppose it would be like a sustained current or like a series of individual zaps?
I don't think it'll be an instantaneous zap. I think it'll be a slow voltage increase to a peak, and it'll probably last anywhere from minutes to hours, to the point where it's not going to be like getting shocked on something.
Okay.
It'll be like slowly entering a more and more energetic and electrical
Like
environment.
strong vibrations or something like that?
Kind of. Yeah, that's actually a really good way to put it. And it'll be the kind of thing where rather than if it was just one shock event in 1 second all around the globe, okay, you're going to have people dropping all over the place. It's going to be the kind of thing where every single human being has a different threshold for their heart, for their brain, for their blood pressure, for their various organs. And people will hit that threshold, unfortunately, at various times throughout that day or two
And
of
do you
shelling.
suppose it would be like the Earth's facing the sun side, like more?
No, it would be the whole planet at the
It
same
wouldn't,
time,
regardless of night or day.
regardless of night or day.
Okay.
Now, there are some things that matter night or day. The quarter of the Earth that's directly facing the sun, when the micronova goes off, they're going to get burned. Absolutely get burned. The sun facing side, starting about 18 hours later and probably extending for a couple of days, so that will include the whole Earth eventually. But there will be the microtektite glass spheral rain coming down from the sky, or any other plasma that's congealed into impactors. And so some things will have no bearing whether or not it's day or night. Some absolutely will. And so, people ask, how long do we have to go down into our bunkers? Well, the answer is when the sun turns red, go down there. But when the shaking starts 3 or 4 days later, come back up just in case it collapses. You don't want to be under there. If your thing survives the shaking, maybe consider the next 2 or 3 days between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. going down there as well. And then obviously, if you get major hail, major wind, major temperature swings, use it for an emergency for a night, for a day, something like that. At no point do I consider sustained living in an underground area to be what's going to be necessary. And that's because that's never been required before. If that was required before, this planet wouldn't look like it has today. Everything would have died because things didn't have the wherewithal to go underground. Okay, humans probably did 12,000 years ago. There's evidence that they did. The deer didn't. The birds didn't. So.
Hold on. Wait. And there was a back there as well, and you wanted to follow up, right?
Maybe he should be in charge of the questions.
Nah. In our goodie bag, you gave us some sunglasses. So in the interim, do you feel like ultraviolet and those are going to be hurting our corneas? Are we going to be danger?
Possibly. It's possible, but I'll tell you what's going to happen before that. There won't be leaves. There won't be flowers. There won't be insects out during the day at all. So if we get to the point where the ultraviolet is strong enough to be affecting the insects and the leaves and the flowers, things like that, to the point where you get sunburn in just a couple of seconds. And it's not just some people, it's everyone. I've heard people on the internet saying, oh, the sun feels so hot, or I'm burning so much more easily now. Stop eating seed oils. I spend so much time out in the sun this summer, not a single burn. But if it gets to the point where literally everyone is burning in a minute, okay, yeah, maybe don't go out and look up. But I also don't expect us to get there, because if it ever did get that bad, what would still be here? If you think about it, that would kill the whole planet, And that's never happened. So it's bad. It needs to be considered. It needs to be prepared for. But this is not the end of the world. It's the end of this age of Earth and the beginning of a new one. It's probably an end to a lot of things in our society that we enjoy, and a lot of things about our society we don't enjoy. Like social media.
You got a question in the back.
You've touched on this before, and we probably don't know any definite answers, but the metals in our body, our teeth, our backs that are, fused and bolted together are
Possibly. It could possibly be affected. It could be as bad as everybody who's got metal in them is completely screwed. It could be as benign as none of those people are completely screwed. I think it's most likely that it'll be dependent on how much you have, what magnetic latitude you're at, what the crustal magnetic fields beneath your feet are, and how strong your body electromagnetic field from your aura to your magnetic field actually is, because that's protecting everything inside of you.
Show over here.
Do we know where the magnetic poles are now?
Yes.
Where are they?
So the South Magnetic Pole, all right, so if this is Australia, can you picture that as Australia? The South Magnetic Pole is like right here, and the North Magnetic Pole blew past the geographic North Pole and is almost to Siberia. Not quite there yet.
Oh, I thought he was behind me. Sorry. With the poles, understand you're showing Indian Ocean, North Pole, South Atlantic anomaly, or the other side of South America? South Atlantic anomaly.
If you're going with the exact opposite side of the Bay of Bengal, it's near Peru or Ecuador.
Oh.
Now, if they're slightly off,
Understand.
okay.
There's which will then give us a new equator
Once we turn, yeah.
once we turn. Now there is evidence of a previous equator running from, it's not a perfect line, but it's close, from Easter Island through Ollantaytambo over to the Dogans
The Dogan
in
Triangle.
Africa, through Giza, Petra, Angkor, Borobudur. That it looks like it was the previous equator. How does that correlate with the 12,000 years and where the poles would be with that equator? Because that equator is not that far, but I don't know if that was a question or not.
So Giza is one of the axes of the tilt. So when you take a ball and you tilt it, whether you tilt it 90 degrees, 180, or you just throw it like that and it's spinning over and over, the parts on the side aren't changing latitude, they're just spinning. So you have the axes of the tilt that don't go north, they don't go south, they just spin, they just turn in place. Yes. Or at least it was at least one point in the past.
Hold on. So is that why people are saying that the pyramids were built and under certain stars like the Orion Belt, and they could stay there even though the Earth is?
Maybe, some of that stuff makes sense to me. Others, I hear it and I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but I need more proof. So I think the next question was actually behind you there, the green shirt.
Are there any ways to that you know about to enhance your bioelectric field?
Yeah. Don't put any crap in your body. Put just good stuff in your body. Get jacked as can be. Isolate your most negative, harmful behaviors. Figure out what insecurities you have that cause those behaviors. Then figure out what deep-seated traumas you have that led to those insecurities. And then go through one of the 3 or 4 good ways of healing traumas. Followed by meditation. That's a good one. Staying positive. Breath work is good for that as well. Basically, everything between, like your Olympic bodybuilder and your like woo-woo hippie friend. Like, just combine the best stuff they have to say. I mean, there's not a better way to say it than that, to be honest with you. Be something in between,
All right, question back here.
Yeah.
Like she was mentioning about the current pole positions that we have enjoyed a lot of data over the past 40, 50, 60 years. Is there anything that's being withheld from us right now that we would like to see?
My goodness, yes. There's probably things we don't know that are being withheld, What we know is this. The US government figured this out definitively in the 50s and 60s. Whatever families are behind governments have probably known about this for much longer. multiple governments are now acting in a way that seems to indicate they're preparing for something like this. And, you know, here's something I'll give, whether you want to call it the elites, the New World Order, the government, deep state, whatever name you want to give to these people behind the scenes, kind of steering the planet. They have been masterfully creative and patient. I mean, if you were watching Alex Jones like 20 years ago, okay, maybe you could connect some dots. But for decades, it was incremental, covert. Baby step here, covert. Well, that's not happening anymore, right? They don't care that we all realize we live in a clown world. They're just being blatant. They're being reckless because they know there will be no reckoning. They are they're basically throwing God under the bus, throwing Satan on top of the pyramid. They are promoting degeneracy and sin and all these other things with reckless abandon, like there's no tomorrow, because on a certain timeline, there isn't one. And what this tells me is they know a whole heck of a lot more than we do. And it's blind luck that we know as much as we do. So they're obviously not telling us the exact strength of the magnetic field. They probably have more information about where the galactic current sheet is and how far away that central magnetic point is. They might even be able to know within a week or a month when all the big events are going to happen. And then there's probably a whole bunch of stuff they know that we don't even know that they know. So on top of the things where I'm like, I can point my finger on this and be like, they're hiding this, they're not telling us, I know they know. There's stuff I'm like, I don't even know what I don't know. So yeah, I would say the answer to your question is a big double yes. Big double yes. I think it's going to be prime rib time very soon. Let's go with maybe one or two more questions. And then you guys can hit the bathroom or whatever you need to do before we eat. You know, wash hands, as Gina was saying yesterday. Oh my God. Yep. 45 for the, oops, sorry.
That's okay.
2035 to 2045 for when the increased chance of the solar kill shot
No,
would be the timeline.
the 2030s or 2040s is the timeline for the magnetic pole flip, the micronova, and the Earth turning over. The solar kill shot could happen tomorrow. There is no time. It's the one part of this that can't be anticipated. The only reason in the world why I can sit here and be like, next sunspot maximum has a better chance of giving us the solar kill shot than this one is because we're going to be 10, 20, maybe 30 percentage points lower in our magnetic field by that point. But let's say a sunspot's being born right now near center disk. By the time we wake up tomorrow, it could be beta gamma delta, the size of Jupiter, and fire an X40 solar flare. And by tomorrow night at this time, the world's back in the Stone Age. It's the one part we can't anticipate, even though we can anticipate just about everything else.
Oh, hey Ben, just for clarity, since it's being recorded, the solar kill shot that could happen tomorrow, that one is a lot less dangerous to us. The kill shot for our modern electronics, but the potential kill shot for people is the micronova and the Earth tilting.
Well, so in general, yes, that is a scarier event for people. However, the indirect effects of the solar kill shot would be pretty bad. I mean, the US government estimates that if the planet lost power, 90% of the people would be dead in 6 months. Because there'd be no water purification or distribution or food production or distribution or refrigeration or the internet or 911 or banks or gasoline or ATMs or heating or cooling or any of those other things. Turn on the tap, nothing comes out. Open your refrigerator, everything's rotten. So,
Gosh, I question right here.
I got it. So the magnetic field risk map on the website for magnetic risk by KP, that was put out a few years ago with
Right.
the recent events. Is it about time to look at that for a revision and maybe change those trend lines versus where instead of an X40 would be it, maybe it's an X30 or even an
So
X25.
that chart should have one of the axes is how far down in the magnetic
Mhm.
field we are. So you got to just look down to where about we are and then go across to where it crosses that line for an X30 or an X20 or an X10. So that the continually weakening magnetic field is actually already built into the chart.
Right, and we see the recent event that was the X4.5 that was basically glancing blow. We saw a KP5 and looking at the chart.
You talking about the one just a couple days ago?
Yeah.
That was a KP. That was a
That was
KP8 level 4
Level-
level 4 geomagnetic
So
storm.
so with that one, it kind of looks like the effects were a little bit to the left of the trend line, indicating that it was worse than it should have been.
And you might have something like that.
I'm just curious if it's enough to
I mean,
shift those trend lines.
I would say that you should look at that chart not as an absolute, but as a pretty good guide. It's never going to be exact. We could have, like, let's say we could measure it down to like, oh, it's X 4.579333210 We could get two of those back to back, hitting Earth in the exact same way, and they could have an order of magnitude difference in their actual storm disruption. Yeah.
Do you want to say the website that you were
Well,
looking?
it's Space Weather News. It's Ben's website,
Ben's
Space
website,
Weather News,
spaceweather-
spaceweathernews.com.
Perfect. Right, I'm gonna watch them back there. She
This
hasn't
will
had a
have to
chance
be
to
the
ask
last
one yet.
one.
Nice, I gotcha. Two more. We got two.
All right, you're in charge.
Yeah, you pointed us to
me, right?
Doug Bott at some point.
Say it again?
You pointed us to Doug Bott at some point. You credit him a little bit for
Yeah.
what
Doug
you
Bott.
learned. And in listening to him and reading his stuff, he's pretty precise about the date he
Yeah.
picks. And
I wouldn't count
why
on
you
that.
Don't.
I wouldn't count
wanna
on
lead you
that.
not to. Okay.
Yeah, he's literally creatively interpreting the Torah and like using numerology to like sniff out codes and other things like that. I don't believe you can peg a day. I don't believe you can peg a year. I think you can give a range of time, but I don't buy that. I didn't like a lot of the stuff he did when it was based on those religious texts. The best stuff he did was he's another source helping to confirm the 12,000 year cycle, the fact that it's tied to a major magnetic shift on our planet. And the best thing he did was really discover those nova level isotopes in the papers. Correlating to those layers in the 12,000 year cycle. Doug was a good friend. I miss him. We had lots of disagreements over the phone a lot of the time. He was a real joy to talk to. It's much more fun to talk to him on the phone than it was Randall Carlson. My God, that was interesting. Every time I pick up the phone, I'd be like, do I have 3 hours to sit here and listen to this? No. But, yeah. What? No, because there's no point. It's like October something 2046. Something less than Gematria, actually. Something weirder. Something he completely invented. Just this idea in his head, like I can look at this number and that's what this means. But hey, don't look at that because of something Cicero did to the writing 1,000 years ago. And yeah, it's guesswork upon guesswork. All right,
Last question.
Oh, this was just a quick one. You mentioned the glacial cycle.
Yeah.
Is that 12,000 year cycle, same thing?
So-
Is it-
The glacial cycle is something slightly different, but we get about one disaster cycle of interglacial warmth, and it's just about over here. The next several cycles should actually be in more glacial conditions. Now, that has the largest effect at mid and high latitude. The tropics, it doesn't affect as much. Now, granted, the world's not going to be oriented as it is today, but that would be pretty bad for Canada if we were to go back into a glacial cycle. It'd be rough for Montana, the northern states. Florida might not notice much difference. A place like here would notice a difference, but it's manageable. Same with somewhere like Pennsylvania or Ohio. There's a difference, but it's manageable. I do think it's very likely that this interglacial is about over. Yeah. Cool.